Welcome r/EntitledParents. M yanks my mum's prosthetic arm off after demanding disabled parking spot. So, this story takes place somewhere in the late 90s/early zeros. Backstory: my mum was in an accident when she was 14 and lost her right arm. She has about 1/4 of that arm left that she calls her stub, and tbh the loss hasn't done much to derail her. She drives. She has a joystick-esque thing which sticks out of the wheel, and she turns it like she's steering a ship. She calls it a knob, loudly and in public. She worked for a long time until she started having issues with the arm she does have, and she's generally been the person in the family to host/prepare all events and do all the labor. Honestly, she's my hero, but you're here for the story, so here goes. Mum and I go to the supermarket at the busy hours on a weekend because we couldn't make our usual after school weekday trip when things were less crazy. We go around the whole parking lot twice, as do a row of cars behind us, and we finally manage to nab a disabled spot right by the entrance because someone was leaving as we approached. Now, my mother rarely uses the disabled parking, even though she's permitted B/C. She always says people who can't walk/etc need it more. But, again, she is permitted, and there weren't any other spaces. After we park and get out, we hear a car honk a few times, followed by "excuse me," as a woman runs up from behind, catching us just before the entrance to the store. This woman literally left her car running in the middle of a busy parking lot, causing a massive bloop. So, Karen, that's her name now, catches our attention with her shouting, and when we turn around, we are greeted with her "Can I speak the manager" haircut, 90s edition, and about half a dozen kids, ranging from goth tween to a toddler in her arms. Karen then goes on to explain how the spot my mum just parked in is for disabled people in an accusatory tone. My mum was wearing her prosthetic arm underneath her long-sleeved denim coat, overly big, so the fingertips of her prosthetic were barely visible, so it was an honest mistake, even though it was a little odd the way she'd abandoned her car and ran up to us with her entire litter. Still, my mum smiles and proclaims, "Don't worry, I'm allowed to park there," and we turn back around. That answer wasn't good enough for Karen. Suddenly, Karen and her kids are in front of us, and she's given the toddler to another of her children, just so she can fold her arms and pout. As you can see, she gestures toward her kids. "I have a lot going on, and I need that spot more than you do. You only have one child." Now, I must have only been 6 or 7, but even I knew the difference between disabled parking and those spaces reserved for parents with small children. I said something along the lines of, "You need a disabled badge to park there. It doesn't matter how many kids you have," in 6, 7-year-old lingo, and this woman took major offense. She goes off on a major rant about how being a mother of all her children was hard, how she was having an awful day/week/month, and how it's not fair that my mum, who looked perfectly fine, had tricked the government into getting a badge that lets her park in a spot that Karen should obviously have instead. As she rambles about this, she looks around, garnering the attention of other shoppers, and is doing that "don't you agree with me" thing that people do to validate themselves, but never gave anyone a chance to respond B/C. She was already on to the next person. My mum grabs my hand and tries to lead me around Karen, ignoring her entirely, but Karen keeps stepping in front of my mum, demanding her spot. She's getting increasingly annoyed/loud. I remember asking my mum several times if I'd done something wrong, because my response seemed to have triggered this rant, but she kept reassuring me it was fine and that I should just ignore her, which annoyed Karen even more. This goes on for about 5 minutes, a very long 5 minutes, before my mum finally snaps, "I have one arm," silencing Karen mid-sentence. I used to wonder why she didn't just tell Karen the specifics earlier, but as I've grown up I've come to realize that it wasn't anyone else's business, and I can see why my mum wouldn't want to take her jacket off, which is kind of a chore for her, and pop the prosthetic just to prove something. So, we begin to walk around Karen again, but barely make it 5 feet before we hear her go, "Bullshit." What happens next is seared into my brain. Karen storms up to my mother and tries to undress her, the denim jacket, and is just shaking / calling my mother a liar, and my mother goes into full fight to the death mode. B/C physical altercations are obviously more intense / scary for her. She starts scratching, flailing, kicking, and even tires landing a headbutt on Karen, and as she does this, one of Karen's children attempt to jump in and help their mum, which leads to me jumping in to help mine, and suddenly I'm brawling with her kids. This couldn't have lasted longer than 30 seconds. It was enough time for people to stop and gather, but not enough for anyone to react / put a stop to it. I can't imagine what it must have looked like. Two women in their 30s fighting as their children do the same by them, but it all came to a stop when, somehow, Karen manages to yank my mum's denim jacket from her, and off pops her prosthetic with it, crashing to the ground, and resulting in a universal gasp that shook the entire parking lot. Okay, exaggeration, but it was definitely a moment. All that's left on my mum's arm at this point is the suction pad and sharp nail-like hook that slots into the prosthetic. It looks like a blade sticking out of her stub, and without missing a beat my mum raises it to Karen, and in a sarcastic tone, goes, "Come on then." I wish I was old enough at the time to realize how hilarious that was. A woman from the crowd that had gathered around us stormed into our little fight circle and picked my mum's arm up and handed it to her before going off on Karen, who looks smaller than 7-year-old me at that point. People start shouting to get security etc, and Karen rallies her spawn and they all run for her car. I still remember her kids yelling for her not to leave them. B/C only her oldest could keep up with her running away as the rest trailed behind. My mum was visibly shaken by the incident, but wanted to save face for me / the crowd that was suddenly hounding us. She insists she's fine, doesn't want the police, doesn't want the fuss, and we go about our shop. When we got to the checkout about 20 to 30 minutes later, a few of the people that had witnessed the whole thing had gathered and insisted they pay for my mum's shop, which she reluctantly accepted. Then they helped us take all the shopping out to the car, and when we get home my mum tells me she doesn't want me getting into any fights ever again. Then she lets me have way too many donuts. To clarify, my mum absolutely cannot stand having her one arm restrained in any way. Grabbing her wrist / hand is a huge no-go. It freaks her out, and all logic goes out the window. Please don't think too poorly of her getting quick to anger / violence in this situation. B/C she honestly is the most level-headed and sweetest person in any other circumstance. Edit. Obligatory this blow up comment. Questions. Did Karen get arrested? No, the police were never called. Why didn't your mum beat her with the prosthetic? Probably didn't think of it in the moment, but she beat my dad with it after he had an affair. How did she lose the arm? Hit by a train. Seriously. I hope she's okay. This was 20 years ago. She's perfectly fine and never wears a prosthetic anymore. I love your mum. Me too. Reddit. Me too. Since everyone seems to love my mum as much as I do now, I just want to share this little unrelated story in the comments. So, my mum lost her arm due to playing on the train lines when she was a teenager. I won't go into the specifics, but yes, hit by a train, not sucked under but sent flying, from what I've been told. Anyway, after she stopped working she was restless, so volunteered for the Cubs group, which in the UK is the younger version of Scouts. Think Boy Scouts in America. She'd often talk about the hazard of playing on / near train lines, and at one point, wanted to go around schools / scout groups doing talks about safety, etc. Especially seeing as hanging out near the train line was still a thing teens did in our town in the 90s. This was still when my mum always wore her prosthetic, so a lot of kids in the Cubs groups would argue as to whether or not she actually had a false arm, because she always wore that long sleeve denim jacket. I was constantly hounded about it. B/C kids are stupid and find this stuff interesting. It was never really something my mum addressed then. It just so happened that the big talk she'd been planning to give that would take up the latter half of our Cubs meetings also fell around Halloween. Yes, this is going exactly where you think it is. Everyone sits down around my mum and listens for a good 30 to 40 minutes about her experience and what happened to her. The coma. Physical therapy. spinal issues she suffered with for a long time, etc. She's hamming it up. To make it more interesting, the lights are dim, and she's got generic Halloween creepy music playing on a CD player beside her. But she hasn't mentioned her arm loss, even though a lot of people are mumbling about it loudly. Parents are arriving and standing at the back of the hall, waiting, and most of the kids are getting quite restless/rude at this point. Finally, someone asks, loudly, if my mum only has one arm, and she responds by reaching into her jacket. She'd purposefully not put the arm in the sleeve and just hidden it under the jacket, and then tears it off, and waves it around in the air with a scream. One kid cried. Parents got worked up. I died laughing, and my mother was asked never to give a speech again.